Perfect. Okay. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in today. I really wish we could all be in the same room because I work so much better that way, and then I can see all of your faces at the same time. But I'm grateful for technology, so at least we can meet, even if it's only virtually. I'm going to turn off my camera so you don't have to look at me the whole time here. There we go. And I'm really excited to be doing this program because the early 20th century is one of the most interesting periods of time, mostly, well, in my opinion, most interesting periods of time because of all the changes we saw in this country in such a short period. From about 1917 until 1923, we saw America become a superpower through World War I. And we saw prohibition and suffrage, and in the years after suffrage, even more freedom for women and other peoples. But really, in under a decade, our country started coming into its own in the modern era. And I really could go on and on about all the amazing things that happened during my favorite era. But I'm here today to talk to you specifically about suffrage for women. And as a woman, I find this topic so fascinating because women fought hard both for it and against it. They were on both sides. And it just blows my mind that there were women who didn't want suffrage and thought it would be the downfall of this country. So as I approached this incredibly complex subject, I had to narrow down my focus. And I decided I would narrow it down by answering 3 questions. Number 1, how did this start and what was our area's response to the suffrage movement? Number 2, what are the ways that women worked to influence the public both for it and against it? And then what happened once the vote was achieved? You know, I mean, after it was ratified, the work couldn't have just stopped, right? So what happened once it was achieved? Today is a very special day because it marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And this is the amendment that gave women the right to vote. This is what we're celebrating. It was ratified August 18th, 1920, and then it was certified by the Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby, on August 26, 1920. And what many people don't realize is that this was a journey that took almost a century to come to fruition. It started well before the Civil War and was linked very closely with abolition, with temperance, and other moral issues and movements. And all of these movements really go hand in hand. Women were the driving force behind them because they were tired of not having control of their own lives. For example, if a woman were married to an abusive alcoholic, she really could not leave him because she had no rights, not to property, not to her children, and not even to herself. So if she did try to leave, she had to leave everything behind, including the children she loves. And even later, just as an aside, the Christian Temperance Union, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest women's organization at that time, they endorsed suffrage in 1881, citing the links between drunkenness and domestic violence, right? So it was imperative for a woman's well-being to be able to get this vote and to have a say in her future. Now, because of all of this, white women in particular felt they could identify on at least a very small level with some of the Southern slaves. They felt that they could identify because they knew what it was like to not have control of your own life. They knew that it wasn't right, and they wanted that right for themselves. And this is a big reason why, especially at the beginning, this women's movement was so closely related to abolition. Many of the women who advocated for suffrage were also strong advocates for abolition and vice versa. Many strong abolitionists were also big advocates for women's suffrage, including Frederick Douglass. Douglass was a slave that escaped to the North, and he became a renowned advocate for both abolition and women's suffrage. And in fact, the movement really took off after a group of white abolitionist women met for tea in 1848. These women are responsible for what we now call the Seneca Falls Convention, or the first women's rights convention in the United States. The convention was called by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Mary McClintock, Martha McCoffin Wright, who was Lucretia Mott's sister, and Jane Hunt. These 5 women resolved to hold a women's rights convention only a couple of weeks prior to having the actual convention. And they thought of this while they were having tea at Hunt's home. 2 of the women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, while they were at this tea, were expressing their grievances about how they had met in 1840. While attending the anti-slavery convention in London, Mott and Stanton were excluded from participating with their husbands simply because of their sex. They had talked then about holding a women's rights convention, but didn't follow through, not until now when talking with all of these ladies. And how many women have been in, have been having coffee with other women, and you all kind of get each other stirred up about a topic. Well, that's kind of what these women did, but they actually followed through with wanting to make a change. And they drafted something called the Declaration of Sentiments. Basically, it was a manifesto that listed all of the wrongs done to women and their demands for rights, including a right to property to help rectify some of these wrongs. The women planned this meeting over the course of the following 2 weeks, and it was a 2-day meeting held in the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, on July 19th through the 20th. And I just want to put a note in here again. This is in 1848, so about 13 years before the start of the Civil War. Now at this meeting, only women were allowed on the first day, but men and women could attend on day 2. And most of the people who attended this meeting were just curious locals. They had seen the write-up in the newspaper about it, and they showed up just to see what was going on. Now, at the beginning of the meeting, Elizabeth Cady Stanton read the goal, and I'm just going to read you an excerpt here because I think it's such a powerful quote, and it says, quote, "We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love," end quote. Such a powerful message right at the start of this meeting. So the Declaration of Sentiments basically listed that women were civilly dead, right? If you can't own property, you can't own money, you can't own anything, you're dead to the government. But if you're single and you own property, it's not much better for you. Yes, you can own property, but you're taxed to support a government that only recognizes you when a profit can be made of you. And so if a road, they want to put a road through your property, you have no way to prevent that. And so women were really struggling with these ideas. Now, Frederick Douglass was not only in attendance for day 2 of the meeting, but he gave an incredible speech, which the papers say, quote, ably supported the cause of woman, end quote. So with the help of Douglass and several other speakers, both men and women, those in attendance were able to vote on the Declaration of Sentiments and given the option to sign it as a kind of petition. Almost all of the resolutions passed on the first vote, except, ironically, for the topic of suffrage. So these women voted to not pursue getting the vote, something that I just find so strange. So the women felt, though, that there were other causes, such as temperance, that were more important for their well-being. But after Frederick Douglass and Lucretia Mott gave some more passionate speeches, all the resolutions passed, including suffrage, but it passed very narrowly. Oh, excuse me. So the proceedings of the meeting were published in local papers and helped the movement gain momentum. However, over the succeeding decades, the suffrage dialogue would face many setbacks as it was drowned out by other issues. Issues such as the Civil War, which I mentioned took place in 1861, and then you have the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, which specified male as a qualification for voting. Then they felt they were dealt a heavy blow when the 15th Amendment passed in 1870. It allowed for suffrage to all men, regardless of race or previous servitude. And then later on, you have it even being drowned out by World War I and the dialogue there. Now, all of this is coupled as well with the fact that other women were working just as hard to keep suffrage from passing. This led to pro and anti-suffrage groups fighting for public attention. And even within the pro-suffrage campus, the women disagreed with how the battle should be fought. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony felt the vote would be won by constitutional amendment, and they founded the National Woman Suffrage Association. Lucy Stone Blackwell and her husband Henry, along with Julia Ward Howe, felt that suffrage would be won on a piecemeal basis and worked on getting the states to pass it individually. And they founded the American Women's Suffrage Association to help with those efforts. One other major difference between these two groups is their members. So the National Women's Suffrage Association members were all female. The American Women's Suffrage Association included men and women. So two terms I want to help clarify. You may have heard a lot recently because of the centennial anniversary, suffragist and suffragette. Now, sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they are not necessarily the same thing. Even 100 or so years ago, the general public made the same mistake, much to the annoyance of both of these groups. The suffragists were women who held civil meetings, wrote letters to Congress, put up displays in local businesses focusing on education. They are the ones who picketed the White House, called the Silent Sentinels. They were the ones which, were forced to undergo the Night of Terror. So the suffragettes were the other side of that coin. They were women who marched, held rallies, and then it caused some amount of chaos, including breaking windows and other things. Suffragists were insulted to be called suffragettes. They felt that what they were doing ultimately hurt the suffrage cause more than it helped, and vice versa. The suffragettes felt what they were doing was more effective than holding tea parties and writing to Congress. So that is clarified for you now. So the Minnesota and the Lake Minnetonka area's response to the suffrage movement really was no different than the rest of the country. This area was also divided on the topic of suffrage. And looking at an excerpt from Excelsior pioneer Lydia Ferguson's diary, she attended the American Women's Suffrage Association annual meeting, which was held in Minneapolis in 1865 at the Church of the Redeemer. She tried to persuade her daughter Alice to join her as well, and she notes that on the first day of the meeting, she had the pleasure of seeing Julia Ward Howe, Lucy Stone Blackwell and her husband, and many other famous ladies, and she was able to have dinner with them in the church vestry. And then the following day in her diary, she noted another happy day at the meeting. So clearly she was pleased by what she heard there. Some women, however, felt that women would be of more benefit to society by focusing on raising children to be good citizens and leaving the vote to their sons and husbands. One Lake Minnetonka woman with this point of view was Marion Lamprey Stemble. Now, Stemble was an active speaker in Minneapolis societies. She was fluent in English, French, and German, and her language abilities were touted in every paper that wrote an article about her. She was highly regarded in these society circles, and she was active in various social clubs and organizations. She was educated in France, and upon returning to the United States, gave lectures on the anti-Jewish sentiment there. Her first husband, Dr. Carltines, was a German immigrant, probably where she learned how to speak German so well. And both of their children, Dorothea and Alvin, were born in France and then immigrated here in 1898. After Carl's death, she married Clarence Stenbell in 1900. Now, he was a superintendent for the railroad, so they had a fairly decent income, and they owned a summer home in Cottage Wood, where they would entertain people, and then she could have a retreat from Minneapolis, her Minneapolis work. After her marriage to Clarence, she continued to teach classes on current events to women in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So she was already an active speaker even before joining the anti-suffrage movement. And in fact, she started out as a pro-suffrage voice, but said that after talking with so many women and hearing their side of the suffrage debate, she changed to anti-suffrage. She was quoted as saying, "No amount of balloting is going to replace the individual care that must be given the home and the family if we are to have noble and honorable citizens. Let us not confuse the ballot with progress." So her whole platform was raising your children to be good citizens. This is a platform common among the anti-suffrage dialogue in the rest of the country as well. Essentially, just leave your vote to your sons and husbands. If you raise them to be good people, you don't really need it. And then she stated how women by this time in 1915 had already won victories in regard to property rights, rights to their children, and all without having the vote themselves. So again, if you focus on being a good mom and raise your sons to be good, women can keep winning these victories and don't really need the vote. Now, as mentioned earlier, the pro-suffrage women were divided on how suffrage was to be achieved, and this is perhaps best exemplified in the story of Bertha Short of Wayzata. Now, this is a story I only recently became aware of, and I haven't had a chance to get to the Minnesota Historical Society to look at some of their club records yet because they're closed, but I'm dying to get in there and see what they have. Now, Bertha she is one of the women in these photos, but I don't know which one. It's not labeled. But she was a very strong, outspoken individual, and she was born in Germany, immigrated to the United States with her parents. She was also active in various Minneapolis clubs and organizations, such as the GAR and the Red Cross. And then she later became the treasurer of the Political Equality Club in Minneapolis. And at the same time was a member of the state committee of the Women's Party. Now, as a member of the Women's Party, she traveled to Washington to picket the White House in November of 1917. There she was arrested along with 30 other women on November 10th, 1917. They were held over the weekend, then released, then arrested again for picketing on Monday the 12th, then released again to await trial. Then arrested for the third time on the same day, they were released on November 13th. And this is a pretty significant date because some of these women would endure the night of terror on November 14th as the authorities in the Occoquan workhouse force-fed and abused some of the women being held there. Now, we know for a fact that Bertha was in Occoquan for several days, but there is no evidence of her being abused as a result of her incarceration, although she did witness some abuse to the other women being held with her, such as Lucy Burns, who was chained to a door, and according to Bertha, she received this punishment simply for bidding the other ladies good night. Now, Bertha took part in the hunger strikes along with the other women, and she said she lasted for 5 days before fainting, and her release followed soon after. Now, as Short is going through all of this in DC, back home, there was an uproar as a result of her arrest by the Political Equality Club. Now, the club president, Dr. Ethel Hurd, called an emergency meeting of the board together to discuss asking Short to resign her position as treasurer. The basis of this request was the fact that the Political Equality Club was completely against picketing and had made public announcements about it. They felt that Short, even though she attended as part of the National Women's Party, should not have picketed while also being the treasurer for their organization. Essentially, there was a conflict of interest. Upon her return home, Short went on a speaking circuit talking about her time in DC as a picketer and being held in the Occoquan workhouse. I did not find evidence that the Political Equality Club actually followed through with their threats to force her to resign. And this is evidenced by the fact that there are newspaper articles following these other articles you see on the screen, and even ones from 1918 that still list her as their treasurer. So I can't wait to get into the Minnesota Historical Society and see if they have some meeting minutes and find out what actually happened during those meetings. Okay, so how did women work to influence the public either for or against suffrage? I have already given you two examples in the story of Marion Stembull of Cottagewood, who gave lectures, and of Bertha Short of Wayzata, who went picketing and then gave more lectures. But local clubs played a role as well. One Excelsior-based club that had influence in the area was the Women's Club of Lake Minnetonka, which tried to educate its members and the public at large by having meetings in members' homes, often inviting active suffragists from Minneapolis, but also from other states. One of the women they invited to speak included Clara Euland, who is now a famous Minnesota suffragist. Clara and her husband, Judge Andreas, lived in Saga Hill, which is a Norwegian immigrant community on the Upper Lake. She was a mother of 8 children, and she refused to raise them to abide by their gender roles. She engaged her boys in cleaning and encouraged her girls to attend college. Her daughter Brenda even became a famous writer later on. She was dedicated to the cause of gender equality and founded the Equal Suffrage Organization of Minneapolis in 1913. She later became the president of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. And the Women's Club of Lake Minnetonka invited her several times to speak at their meetings and special events. And Clara later became the first president of the Minnesota League of Women's Voters after suffrage had passed. Now, in addition to lectures, some of the members of the Women's Club wrote newspaper articles or rebuttals, and they were included in the Minnetonka Record, which was owned by fellow club member Rowena Dillman and her husband Willard. Although Willard was technically the owner, he was usually busy with his other newspaper and left the Minnetonka Record in the care of his wife. And Rowena basically took care of the Minnetonka Record from about 1912 to 1937. In 1915, the club members also put up a suffrage exhibit in the windows of Excelsior businesses, including the Record, again operated by Rowena Dillman, the Citizens State Bank, and H.H. Whitmore's. So these suffrage exhibits were kind of a big deal because they could be prominently displayed in the big windows and area businesses, and people could go in and get information. This was really focusing on education. So what happened once the vote was achieved? Minnesota was the 15th state to ratify the 19th Amendment on September 8th, 1919. And by this time, it was clear that suffrage is basically inevitable, and the political parties were vying for female support. In March of 1920, the Republicans held a campaign rally in Excelsior, sponsored by the Excelsior Republican Club. Women not only attended this rally, but at least one of them gave a keynote speech. And at the close of the meeting, there were two women who were elected as vice presidents. I just want to point out two things with this slide here. Can you guys? I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I love how Mrs. Remington is the one that gave the speech, and she was talking about her favoring the Republican Party, but she admitted that as a child of 6, she had desired the election of Grover Cleveland. And then this here. So W.I. Nolan paid his respects to the Democrats for their 8-year orgy of errors and mismanagement, but saved his heaviest ammunition for the American enemies of representative government. I love reading the old newspaper insults. They are so much fun. If you guys get any time on your hands, go to the Library of Congress's Chronicling America and just read through some of the old newspapers. They are a hoot. And then, not to be outdone, the Democrats held a caucus in April to elect 2 delegates to attend a Democratic county convention in Minneapolis. And they had a rebuttal for the Republicans. All Democratic voters, women and men, who do not allow the Republican newspapers to do their thinking for them and who have not been swept off their feet by the transparent and ridiculous propaganda of those same newspapers, are respectfully invited to be president. Gotta love good old-fashioned mudslinging. Clearly, contention between these two parties is nothing new. Women who were influential in the suffrage movement also were doing what they could to persuade other women to use their vote on the candidate of their choice in the new election. For example, in October 1920, the Women's Club of Lake Minnetonka received a telegram informing them that the famous Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the former president of the National Suffrage Association, was supporting the Democratic candidate James Cox in the election because he was going to bring us into the League of Nations. One more thing about this telegram. So this was sent to the Women's Club and they wanted it to be read out loud during a meeting. The Women's Club was not a political organization. They did not want to be endorsing one candidate or the other. They wanted to be nonpartisan. And so they did not read this at their meeting, but instead it was printed here in the newspaper. So when women finally won the right to vote in August of 1920, the groups that fought hard for suffrage now felt a new pressure. They had to make sure women could successfully employ their new right because in November, many women across the country would vote in a presidential election for the first time in their lives. The Women's Club of Lake Minnetonka again took it upon themselves to make sure their members and other women in their community were educated enough in politics to make wise decisions at the polls. The president's notes from the 1920-21 club year read, "The club is now looking forward with a broad vision to making good citizens of the members, to make sane and safe voters, as in August 36 states acted in favor of the Susan B. Anthony suffrage amendment, and it became the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States." That year, the club refocused their attention from the suffrage department to the citizenship department, which was led again by Rowena Dillman. Under Dillman's leadership, the Citizens Department of the Women's Club brought in more speakers and employed creative methods to help women understand their new duties. She made sure that these opportunities were regularly included in the newspaper she managed. One of the speakers they brought back was Clara Euland, who educated on the fact that there are so many things to consider with this new duty, such as which party you belong to, whether you are going to vote with your husband and brothers or not. And she urged the women to study the issues and vote based on their own convictions. These were things these women did not have to think of before. The Women's Club also held a mock election in October of 1920. Rowena acted as one of the election judges, and there the women learned the entire process of voting, including how to properly fold a ballot. The details of the meeting note that the room was crowded with women eager to learn about their new duties. And in November, the club also sponsored a League of Women Voters convention held in Excelsior. Now, all this paid off that November at the polls as women turned out to vote. In Excelsior, out of 420 votes cast, 202 were from women. And in case you're wondering, the people of Excelsior voted overwhelmingly for Warren G. Harding, who received 327 of the 420 votes. His Democratic opposition and the favorite of Carrie Chapman Catt, James Cox, received only 65. Did not even break triple digits. Sorry, Carrie. The end, right? Wrong. We would hope that this was the end of the story. After so many years of struggling, finally all citizens could vote, regardless of race or gender. No, we know that problems with enfranchisement persisted well after 1920. And this is because the states controlled the voting process just as they do today. They used what means they could to prevent certain groups from voting for reasons other than gender. And these were especially egregious in the South, where states passed election laws and procedures to keep Black men and women from voting, and these lasted well into the 1960s. Poll taxes, for example, had to be paid before being allowed to vote, but in some cases, a person could be grandfathered into the poll taxes, that is, not pay their poll taxes, if their ancestor voted before the Civil War. So this ruled out a lot of African Americans right off the bat. The poll tax was upheld by several Supreme Court cases as late as 1951, was officially prohibited in 1964 by the 24th Amendment. The passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 helped with a lot of this. It prohibited racial discrimination in voting. This prohibits states from imposing voting laws that result in discrimination based on race or language, which further upheld the 14th and the 15th Amendments. Even after this, laws also prevented poor people from voting, both Black and white, through the use of voting tests issued by the states. They required a potential voter to pass a literacy and civics test. And it wasn't until 1970, through an amendment to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that these tests were outlawed nationwide. So what did we really learn from all of this? I think the key to the suffrage movement is persistence and having the courage to act even in the face of severe consequences. Women like Bertha Short, who was jailed repeatedly and essentially faced banishment from her friends back home. She didn't care, she kept doing it. I think what we can learn from the suffrage movement is best described by the very quotable Frederick Douglass when he said, "Without a struggle, there can be no progress." Thank you.